everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Hi, Krista.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Great. So welcome, guys. Today, Krista and I are going to be chatting about navicular disease, which again is not something that I'm very familiar with. So I'm looking forward to learning loads. If you guys are live with us, let us know where you are in the world. Let us know if you can hear and see us clearly. And let us know if you have any questions. We want to know about your cases, if you have horses with navicular disease, if your own horse has navicular, or if you have patients. Let us know, and what your experiences have been dealing with that. And so, Krista, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I am going to make a quick change to our screen quickly. And then I am going to ask you a question, Krista. So, as you guys all know, welcome to everyone who's joined us. We are getting prepped for the Vet Rehab Summit. And this year, it's all about research meets reality. Okay, so sometimes the research is great and sometimes it's not. And it's not useful to us. It's not helpful. So we are on a mission right now to really bring as much research to the forefront of our minds as we can, either that which is clinically helpful or that which is not, and why it's not, and what we need to do about that. So before we dive into this topic of navicular disease, Krista, I want to know from you, what is the research article that you quote most often to your clients?
So I'm going to go slightly against the grain. The reason I quote this article, so it's a Sue Dyson article, and she was talking about navicular and the treatment for navicular. And it was a few years ago, I think it was 2006, so obviously things have changed a little bit since then. But she defined a typical navicular horse's return to work prognosis as 10%, and that was the best case scenario. So with a 90% failure rate using traditional methods, it makes you kind of reframe what you're doing and why. And so in comparison, Rockley Farm, who are a barefoot rehab facility in Devon in the UK, they have done a study themselves, not peer reviewed, but their own stats from their own horses, and they've got an 85% success rate using the barefoot rehab method. So yeah, there's a lot of information out there now around biomechanics and the impact of that on lameness and compensatory patterns. So all of that stuff is great now, but for navicular itself, unfortunately, not that much superb information out there. So I'd love anyone who wants to do a study, I'd love to help.
Well, this is a great example, right? Because essentially the research doesn't help us with reality, and it's not the world that we're facing, and the one that we are facing doesn't have research to back it up. So if you're getting good results with the barefoot method, where is the research to back that up, and how can we then show that to our clients to say this is what we're getting, or how can we find the ways to make that even better? Where are the drawbacks? So, okay, great. That was a fantastic introduction to our topic. Guys, if you can hear us, see us, let us know where you are in the world, what you're up to, and what your experience is with navicular disease. And do you see it in your patients? Do you see it in your clients? How do you rehabilitate it? Or who do you send them to? I really want to know. So, Krista, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience with navicular.
Perfect. So I'm Krista. So my practice is called From the Ground Up, and we specialise in barefoot rehabilitation for navicular and other lower limb lameness issues. So my background, the reason I'm here, I had my own horse, Buddy. When he was 6 years old, he was diagnosed with navicular. And my options were not great. His prognosis was very poor. My vet said, look, you can hack him out on bute, maybe do some light schooling, but really he's only 6, so probably the best thing to do is put him down. And I was like, God, how have I ended up here? And deep down, I didn't think it was the right thing to do. So I started doing loads of research. What was the option? Were there any options out there for me? Everything was kind of bleak and doom and gloom. But then I found out about Rockley Farm. And so I spoke to Nick and sent Buddy down there for rehab. I'd never had a barefoot horse ever in my life before. So it was a massive culture shift for me. I'd always evented. So I've been a traditional shod and studded, my whole life. So I had to really take a look and be like, okay, what do I now need to do to change? And within 8 weeks of being at Rockley, he was sound. And then we were back out competing a few months later. And he went on, and he's 15 now. He's still sound, he hacks out all the time and jumps and does whatever he wants to do. So, for me, Buddy has been my inspiration for everything. So since then, I had to massively educate myself, because 10 years ago, people, well, still now, barefoot is a bit of a dark art, but even more so then. And I was surrounded by people who told me that I was cruel, that it was impossible, that I'd never be able to do road work, I'd never be able to canter a 20-metre circle on grass. And lots of people said, you can't do this and you won't do this. But Buddy was showing me, his feet were getting better and better, and he was sound. And, my vet was very supportive of the decision, which was great. And actually now we still work very closely together, and he refers clients my way now too. So that's kind of how I got here.
That's amazing. I don't really want to go into the barefoot versus shod discussion. It's it's still now a very controversial discussion. But I read, following some of Yogi's stuff, I read a comment on one of his posts where someone said that if you're shoeing a horse because they're unsound, then are they sound when they're shod, or are you just hiding the symptoms? And is that fair? And that made me really think, like, there are reasons to be unsound. And if we're just masking the symptoms by putting shoes on, which I don't think is always the case, but it definitely could be in some cases, then are our horses actually sound when we put those shoes on? Or are we just sticking a plaster on and pretending everything's okay?
Yeah, I agree. I have to say, I should probably say this right now, I am not anti-shoeing. I think I'm pro-horse. And so if the horse is comfortable and sound and moving in the right way and using the foot properly, if it's shod brilliantly, that's great. I have got no issues with that whatsoever. What I do have issues with is what you have just said, people whose horses are showing signs of discomfort even when they're shod. If horses are uncomfortable over surfaces, people say, oh, the horse can't cope with the hard ground, just put some pads on. And actually, why is the horse uncomfortable on those surfaces? And it's a whole horse methodology. Unfortunately, I wish it was simple, but it's not as simple as just, and going, oh, okay, we do this, and this, everything's fine. Having a performance barefoot horse actually involves a lot more and looks at diet, movement, and actually probably trim comes last in that kind of process. So all horses should have that healthy foundation of the right diet, and but it's tricky.
And I love that you said that Buddy was showing you, and I think that that's what we so often lack, is just observe the horse in front of you. We don't have all the answers, but they will show us if something's working or not working, and then we can continue on the journey to find what they need. But if we're not observing, if all we do is listen to the advice that we've been given and we're not observing what they are telling us, then it doesn't help. Then we're going to keep hitting a brick wall. So I just want to say hi to Marie, who's joined us from Latvia. That's pretty cool. She says, in navicular rehab, following Pete Ramey, Nick Hill, Alicia Harlow tips, Rockley experience and advice, confused regarding surfaces for navicular horses. Could it be that they can tolerate flat and firm surface? As noticed that soft and hilly slows the progress. Any tips regarding surfacing hills, soft or hard ground in navicular rehab? That is a fantastic question. Go for it, Krista.
It's a very, very good question. And unfortunately, it's not going to be a short answer. So there are lots and lots of different opinions and views on surfaces for navicular horses. Considering the people that you've quoted, I'm assuming you're talking about barefoot horses, so I will go on that route. So any conformable surface is great for a horse that's newly transitioning out of shoes. So what we are trying to do is find supportive surfaces that aren't going to, aggravate or upset the hoof balance in any way, because most of these horses have super compromised hoof function already, so they may have very flat feet. They've obviously got long toes, low heels, because that's the profile that we would expect with a navicular horse. And so the idea is that we try and transition them as comfortably as possible. Now, with all of my clients that I'm working with that come out of shoes, what I tend to do is leave them right to the end of their normal shoeing cycle. So if they are normally shod kind of 6 to 8 weeks, I would say, right, we leave them until maybe 8 weeks and then take off the shoes and just leave them. So the horse still has a little bit of wool that's left and isn't going straight onto kind of sole loading immediately. Now, the reason I do that is because obviously it's a huge transition, not just for the feet, but actually biomechanically for the horse and the way that they move when you remove the shoes. So we keep that little bit of hoof wool, so it provides a little bit of protection. I hate that word, but that's what we're doing. So that slowly wears down while they get used to kind of moving around. And doing that, we reduce some of the issues that you can traditionally see of horses coming out of shoes, of kind of gimping along, and it just looks very awful and uncomfortable. So I personally use like wood chip surfaces. Pea gravel is raved about. I use it in very specific areas because unfortunately it disappears into the ground. Even if you prepare it and have a membrane and all of the amazing stuff, it just goes. But that is kind of gold standard. If you don't have anything like pea gravel, anything that's oolite stone, so like limestone, so oolite is round stones rather than like spiky stones. So anything like that is good. Sand is good. But of course, as the process goes on, you want to give them the opportunity to toughen their feet up as well. So it's a really fine balance between giving yourself a surface that's going to work brilliantly in the beginning to then one that's going to work better for you as you've kind of followed the transitioning process. I would say probably the biggest thing to watch for, particularly if your horse has collateral ligament issues, which very often come hand in hand with navicular and DDFT issues as well, you need to have smooth surfaces. So anything with any form of camber or rutted ground really becomes an issue for these horses. And actually, when they're walking over stonier ground, very often, like the big stones that you get rather than the tiny, mini little ones, those people think that it's the horse that can't actually cope because the sole is sensitive to the stone. Actually, it's more likely that the camber of moving the foot over that stone is actually causing the problem and causing the kind of lamer steps. So those things tend to take longer time, and they're always, when I'm working with my rehab clients, I say to them, they're the things that are going to really affect you moving forward. So you have to be super conscious about the type of ground that you're doing fast to work on. Walking, they can cope later on, but the reality is once you've, as you know, with any kind of ligament or tendon, once you've had a strain once, it's there, and so you then just have to be conscious of managing that moving forward.
I really like that. It makes me think of we're busy with a webinar series at the moment on exercise physiology, and last night we covered general adaptation syndrome, which basically speaks about the alarm phase, the adaptation phase, and then an exhaustion phase. And essentially what I've heard now, having just watched this webinar, is that during that initial alarm phase, when the foot is completely shocked into a new environment that it's not adapted to, you need to be very conscious of the surfaces that it's on so that you can reduce the amount, reduce the shock to the system, because the foot and the hoof and the mechanics are not adapted to that. And then there's an adaptation phase where you need to be adding hard surfaces and adding some stress so that it can adapt to the new stresses. And then that was a bit of a tangent, but I'm not going to get to ask you any of my own questions because we have another question that's already come in. So chiropractically, what are the main areas that you notice to be a problem in navicular horses? And also, what are the main muscling changes or imbalances, or I would add compensation patterns that you might see?
Yeah, so traditionally, the navicular horses show a very strong pattern. So what happens ordinarily when you have a horse that is showing or has been diagnosed with navicular or is pre-stage or whatever, what will have happened is the horse has started to land toe first rather than heel first. And so what happens then is you get a reduction in movement through the shoulder, which then obviously then has compensatory patterns through the rest of the body. So I normally see it. Sometimes you get a bit of tension through the pole, but I think that's probably normal with most horses that are in work of any kind. But definitely around C3, C4, that it's normally rigid and absolutely locked. And so because they're just bracing themselves and trying to hold their neck to stop them having to move around too much, you get real big blockages there. All through the thoracic sling, through the shoulder, through the trapezius, all of those muscles, pecs, everything kind of front end, everything there gets again tight and reactive. And very often there will be, normally with navicular it's bilateral, but there will always be a worse limb. And so you always see compensation in the opposite forelimb and normally in the diagonally opposite hind as well. So you would see tension then through the lumbar and also all through the glutes and hamstrings. So that's quite a long list. But normally those kind of trigger points you will see very often in a horse that's presenting with navicular or is rehabbing through those issues as well.
And in terms of their posture and how they're standing, are they weight shifting towards the back? How are they standing? Yeah.
So very often you will get, you know, the traditional laminitic stance where they shift weight underneath. Some horses will point a toe, anything to get the weight off the back of the heel. Very often they will do weird things with their hind limbs as well. And we very often will see compensation. So a lot of these horses will have SI issues, some have issues, and some even have kissing spines if it's been going on for a considerable period of time.
Okay, very interesting. Keep those questions coming, guys. I love it. I saying now that they do some funny things. I read about a horse who would take the straw in his stable and make a pile and then stand on it in a specific way to offload their heels or to offload the heels. And I thought that was really creative and interesting of the horse, but a really nice observation tool for the owner, right? If you are there first thing in the morning and you can see what they've done with the bedding, then that can be really valuable feedback from your horses. Do you have any, have you seen other things like that?
Yeah, I've seen horses that will, if they've got rubber matting in part of their stable, they will shift and just tip their toes over the front of the rubber matting. Or again, if they've got a stable with a drop, they do the same. So they shove to the edge and just kind of rock the toes over the front, which again is very clever. But they show a lot. I mean, I tell all of my clients when they start the rehab program, the physical changes I can see myself. I'm not so interested actually in those. The ones that I really want the owners to pay attention to are those random behavioural changes that only they would really know and understand, because they can be really key indicators that either things are going well or things are going badly. So that's a really important part of rehab, to know if you're doing the right thing with your horse at that time.
Yeah, I think behavioral changes can be very they can be one of the first signs, like when we're talking about the hoof, especially, adaptation and change takes such a long time to show itself in different ways in the hoof and in the rest of the body, that just looking at their behavior can really help us catch on early to how they're feeling and what they're doing. Do you have experiences of supporting arthritis of the navicular bone in an already barefoot horse?
Yeah, I do. So funnily enough, I was speaking to a few new clients this morning about exactly that. So the challenge with navicular is it's seen now as being a shod problem. It's not. it's a movement problem. And so if for whatever reason the horse is moving badly, i.e. they're landing toe first or flat, then that's the bit that we need to change. And that can happen with barefoot horses, it can happen with shod horses, it doesn't matter. What we have to find out is why that happened. And I mean, I'm working with a horse right now who has been barefoot for a while, but actually I'm pretty convinced the issue started with a saddle fit issue. And so the horse changed its movement to compensate for the poorly fitting saddle and started moving tighter and tighter and tighter, and then just got into a cycle that it couldn't fix itself. And so by the time that was fixed, it was too late because that chain had already begun. But really basic things like horses that have thrush, I mean, that is far more prevalent than I think people realise. So any frog that has any form of split in it, there is thrush in there. If you've got kind of the bum crack heels and the contracted heels, there's thrush in there. And so those real basic things that can be huge red flags and cause compensation issues later, they just seem to be ignored. I for sure, I didn't know. When I was at home, I let my farrier do everything with my horse's feet and I trusted what they said. But now I know that actually, you know, none of us know everything. You know, we all have to rely on each other to kind of keep us educated and up to date. So yeah, try and speak to as many farriers and other professionals as I possibly can to try and spread the word, but in a non-confrontational way. I'm trying not to be a crazy barefoot lady.
It's so interesting that we put so much trust in, like, because we put so much trust in our farriers to manage our horses' feet, but they're only there every 6 to 8 weeks. They don't see them in between. And you know, chatting to Yogi a little while ago, if you guys watched that interview, it was really great. But one of the things that came up in that conversation was that farriers don't feel like they can make changes, right? So they also feel stuck in the pattern of what is acceptable and normal, and suggesting changes to owners that might be expensive or pricey is just, it's not often taken well, and it's not often accepted, and so they don't do it sometimes. And so, like, we've put our trust in a professional who's only seeing our horse for a very small space of time, like over a 6 to 8 week period, and who feels that they can't make changes because we won't accept them. So that's a very interesting not helpful cycle, right? That we need to break out of. So really, let's talk to each other and discuss what's possible and what's okay and what is ideal and not ideal and how we get there. Very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's, you know, owners have to take responsibility as well, because, you know, there are some owners out there who are not interested. They just want their horse working. They don't care how it happens. They just want the horse to do a job. And again, that's totally fine. That works for them. But then there are other owners who are really quite open-minded and will want to have that conversation with their farrier. But then they're scared to have the conversation because they don't want to be seen as like telling the farrier, you know, how to do their job. But, you know, I always say to all of my clients, my bodywork clients and my rehab clients, just ask why. You know, if your farrier or whoever, whichever professional you're using, if they can't explain to you why they're doing something, that is a huge red flag. And we should all be open as professionals to tell people why we're doing things. And if you're not open to doing that, then maybe this isn't really the right thing for you to be doing. Controversial.
No, I agree with you. We should want to tell them why. Like, it should be really exciting when an owner comes to us and says, why are you doing that? Because then we can, you know, we can get all sciencey and interesting on them because they've asked us, so we can. Marie asked another question. She says, do you use boots with pads in rehab or with pads inside which stimulate more frog?
The short answer is very rarely. So my preference is to rehab without boots. for a couple of reasons. One, I like the horse to be self-trimming through rehab, so we try and interfere as little as possible with what the foot is doing. It does mean you end up with some really ugly feet, and that can be quite traumatic for the owners to deal with, particularly if they've got, if they're on livery yards and other people are putting their opinions across. So you end up with these feet really changing new angles. So you end up with an angle coming in here and like a new angle coming in here, and people are like, oh my God, what does my horse's foot look like? But it's a tricky thing to deal with. So anyway, so I like them to be self-trimming, which you can't obviously do with boots and pads. But also I like to be guided by how comfortable the horse is. And so it's like we don't use bute or any other NSAIDs during rehab because the horse pushes itself too far. So I want to know what their comfort levels are, and we are always aiming towards getting a heel first landing. And you can sort of fake a heel first landing in boots, and then when you take the horse out of the boots, the landing actually isn't anything like that. So for me, it changes the dynamic. So if I'm saying to a client, okay, let's boot your horse and you can now go and do 15-20 minutes of work a day, well, that's okay. But then if out of the boots, if the horse is still landing flat, and ordinarily I would never, start working the horse properly in that kind of situation, they only start working properly when they're heel first, then, it's like, well, which bit do you take, the boots or the real life version? So that's not to say I don't use boots and pads because sometimes I do. So again, I'm totally horse driven. So as long as the horse is comfortable with what we're asking them to do, then I carry on without boots and pads. But there are some horses whose feet are so compromised, or they're in an environment whereby it's a tough surface for them to live in, then yes, we will use boots to keep the horse comfortable, but we try and use them as minimally as possible. So I walk them over those tough surfaces, and then we go around the field and they're without the boots, and etc. The other time I would potentially use boots is in a confidence situation. So for some of the horses who have been lame for a long time, you see them start to play with their landings. So by the time they're ready to go, they've gone from kind of toe first to flat to then they're trying with heel first. And I review all of my clients every week. And so you see them in their footage and they're like, oh, I'll go heel first for one step. And then, oh, I can't do it. And some horses kind of stay in this mentality where they hold the pain, the body holds the score. And so they think it's going to hurt to land like that. And so we try everything that we can, but sometimes you just need to put a pair of boots on so they can go, oh, okay, it doesn't hurt. And then they start to move in a better way again. And then you take the boots off and that carries on. So yeah, sorry, again, long answer. But yeah, so it depends.
I like it. I like that you've said that the body holds pain. It's an interesting thought to think of and to kind of hold in our minds that when there's an injury or chronic pain or long-term compensation, that the body holds on to that and remembers that, and it's very difficult sometimes to let that go. So Marie says, thank you so much, great answer. And I want to just like backtrack a little bit and say, what actually causes navicular? Why are we seeing it? What is going on there?
So the short answer is, as I said earlier, it's a movement issue. So what happens is the horse changes its movement pattern. So a shod horse will typically land flat to heel first. Normally they should be landing towards the back of their foot, but because of the shoe, they normally land flatter. Whereas a barefoot horse should be landing heel first. And I will put here now, there's a caveat that not all horses will land heel first because for whatever confirmation reason, but the majority. So when a horse starts to get navicular type issues, what has tended to happen is they are landing toe first. And so why does that happen? Well, a whole host of different reasons. So it will start with some form of pain in the back of the foot. So with shod horses, that can be because the frog is no longer doing what it was meant to do. And so you now have contracted heels, a low heel profile and a long toe profile. That's kind of the classic navicular foot profile if you're going to look at it from the side. And then thrush, as I mentioned earlier, that's a big issue. But anything that forces the horse to change its movement for a period of time will lead to compensation and then damage. So what happens with navicular is actually, or it's disease now rather than just talking about the navicular bone syndrome that we used to kind of have it scheduled as. But what happens typically is it starts with soft tissue damage. So particular with when you see the navicular bone changes, it normally, again, normally, not all the time, starts with DDFT issues. So when the horse, it's almost like, I think of it as kind of like carpal tunnel, like repetitive strain injury. So if you do it yourself, I mean, if you have your fingers there and you put them on a desk and you just slam your palm down over and over a period of time, that actually starts to hurt your wrist a little bit, because that's actually not the way that your wrist is meant to function. It's the same with horses. Whereas if you put the palm of the flat of your hand down first and then put your fingers down, well, you could do that for ages, because that's actually the angle that your hand is meant to work at. Now, with the horses, it's exactly the same. So they start to move like that. And the DDFT, I don't much use the word wears the bone away, because that sounds a bit dramatic, but that action puts more pressure onto the navicular bone, which then causes degeneration over time. The same with lateral landings. So if your horse is landing medially or laterally, then actually you have got collateral ligament issues that are either there or they are starting. So every horse should land flat and straight. And if it's not, you need to start looking at why, because that could be a red flag.
That's so interesting. So essentially, navicular disease is secondary to something else. Does it ever occur primarily and then lead to those changes in the rest of the body? Do we know that answer?
Not that I'm aware of, but horses are horses, so potentially.
Yeah, like I said, do we actually have an answer to that? But that's really interesting. So anything that changes that movement to put extra strain on the heel, that's really, really interesting. So how do you treat navicular?
So
right? Different from,
so I would say the traditional method of treating navicular would be using a bar shoe, potentially with a wedge, to relieve the discomfort on the DDFT, steroid injections, and bute and pain relief is not. That's really it. Well, actually, that's a lie. Osphos and Tildren are also other options. I personally don't like those. I think they cause a weakness in the bone. But again, the trouble is with navicular treatment, people will give things a shot because they see that it's degenerative. So the vets will say navicular is degenerative because that's what's traditionally been thought. The reality is not the case. Rockley have several cases. Buddy, I redid his x-rays and they showed bone remodeling within 12 months of his original diagnosis. So it's like anything in life, if you fix the original cause, then you can actually cure it. There will always be a weakness there because that's life. Like when you break a bone, it's exactly the same. It's not going to be the same as it was originally, but you can get back to having a healthy, functional horse.
Okay, so talk a little bit more about your approach. Obviously, firstly, finding the cause. Why did that movement change occur in the first place, and then addressing that. And then you're going barefoot, and you've mentioned already that you're kind of letting them self-trim and they look terrible. How on earth do you convince owners to do that? Because I would be super, I wouldn't want to do that to my horse. That goes against and my horses are all barefoot already, so you don't even have to convince me to take shoes off, but to not trim them and just let them grow out, and they have flares and cracks. And how do you go through that?
So in all honesty, most of the owners that I work with and most of the people that come to me are at the end of the road. So they have tried all the traditional stuff, and so they're sort of willing to give anything a go, so they're a bit more open-minded. But it still, even then, can be a bit of a shocker for them. So I say right at the beginning, this is what's going to happen. I'm very clear with kind of worst case scenario. But of course, everyone wants their horse to be better. So they're like, yeah. And then kind of weeks in, they go, this horse is doing some really weird stuff. And that's fine. So what I always say is, when a horse is rehabbing, you never judge it from what you can see when the horse is stood on its feet. You only ever judge it from the sole. So that's where you can see all the changes. So in a rehabbing horse, what happens is very often the heels have run forward and the toes are very long. And so we are working towards creeping those heels backwards and shortening the toe. Now, we can do that by just dumping off the toe and trimming it. But realistically, you're just then pushing the weight back and forcing the horse to put the weight at the back of the foot when it's not ready to do that. So the program that we follow is, well, I have a program, but I've never done the same thing twice for a horse because they're all very different. But we have certain milestones that we're working towards. So the first one is getting that heel first landing. And so we do a lot of pole work exercises. There's lots of proprioception work that we do with the horses because, again, most of them have been shod, some of them haven't. But they will all kind of have this tripping thing that's typical with the navicular horses. So they don't know where their feet are, and particularly if they've been shod for a while, they have to kind of re-engage that process again to understand what each of their feet are doing. And so pole work is a big part of the exercise program that we do, and that's easy for them to do in the early stages. We do introduce kind of hard, smooth surfaces very quickly because, again, that helps with the self-trimming. So the self-trimming piece, we don't just let them grow and do crazy stuff on their own. So the idea is that we balance wear versus growth. So we build up gradually, but the idea is that the horse only grows what it needs based on the work level that it's doing. So if you're clever and treat the horse's feet like you would a traditional fitting program for any horse, you know, I've always done it. You know, I don't ride as much over the winter because the weather's awful. So come the autumn, I start to naturally slow my work down to cope with the change in light, the change in weather, or the change in surface. So through the summer, I normally do more hacking and, you know, lots of work out of the arena. Whereas in the winter, I'm usually only hacking at weekends and spending more time in the arena. So I will shift the work naturally, kind of it all goes gradually down, and so the horse adapts to that without you having to do anything. And then when spring comes, or just before spring, when you start ramping the work up again, you just gradually, the same with your fitting program, you're fitting the feet to kind of cope with these ups and downs in work. The only problem comes if they have to suddenly stop working for whatever reason, and then you haven't got the wear versus growth issue sorted, so then you would probably have to trim.
Okay, very, very interesting, guys. Are there any more questions? Let us know. I have been loving the things that have been coming from you guys. I think the last thing I would like to touch on, unless there are more questions, is how has your approach been accepted by other professionals? The way that we work together as a team is so important, right? And the feet are one of the things that teach us that, because it's not just one thing. It's the diet, the environment, the work, it's everything combined, all the surfaces that they're on, accumulated over time, and all of that with a whole team. So how do you cope with working within a multidisciplinary team and presenting them with an alternative way of dealing with navicular disease that they might not be familiar with or comfortable with or aware of?
Yeah, I mean, probably unsurprisingly, I get a lot of pushback, or my clients get a lot of pushback, particularly from their vets and farriers. But I'm always more than open to having conversations. Really, vets and farriers aren't that interested in talking to me. I will always send them a report if they're interested. Most of them are like, oh, whatever, we don't really care. Most people who are interested are the physios. Any kind of body worker. So I normally have quite a good peer-to-peer relationship with most of my rehab clients and whoever their kind of hands-on professionals are as well, which is super helpful because they are seeing things and feeling things that I, again, because I do a lot of remote work with some of my clients. So, you know, it's great. I love working with other people because, again, I don't know everything. And so always having another pair of eyes on a situation helps, because sometimes, you know what it's like, you get blinded to certain things. And if you see the same horse every week, you know, it's the same with my own horses. I have to video my own horses to make sure I don't miss anything. I take photos of all my horses because I see them every single day. And so it's hard to keep track of all those really subtle changes that all of a sudden you look at and go, how did that happen? So there's no ego, I suppose, with me. So I don't really care who I work with. The more people, the better, because I'd like to spread the message of what we're doing and how we can help more horses, really.
Okay. Marie says, is there any use to make any extra ultrasound MRI to help with rehabilitation for horse with diagnosed navicular with a cyst in the navicular bone?
In all honesty, no. I had this very frank conversation with my vet originally, with Buddy. In fact, he was very good. He said there's no point sending him for an MRI because there was significant damage on the X-ray. So you can make assumptions that if there's bone damage, there is going to be soft tissue damage. And it wouldn't have changed any of the way that we would treat. And so, no, the rehab plan doesn't and wouldn't change, because the horse will tell you when it's more comfortable by how it's landing and how it's moving. So it's always nice to know. But I always think if there's issues, you know, and with insurance and people who only have a certain amount of money to spend, then, you know, it doesn't make a huge amount of difference to the treatment.
I like that. I think that's always something to keep in mind, is that, like, is having that information going to make a change to what you're doing? And certainly when we don't have a diagnosis and we're in the dark, that makes it really hard to be effective with the plan. But if we have a diagnosis from an X-ray, if we have a good idea of what's going on, then that's enough information, you know. So I like that. I don't have any other questions. So if you guys are happy, thank you so much, Krista, for joining me today. I've really enjoyed chatting to you about navicular. I've learned a great deal. So thank you.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Okay, guys, mark your calendars, please, for the 13th of November. That is the Vet Rehab Summit. And when I say mark your calendar, I mean block the day off, because you will want to be there live, okay? No recordings this time around, all right? Be there live. It's going to be amazing. So I'm really, we have some great things planned. Block your calendars, 13th of November. All right, have a great day, guys. Bye.
Bye.